Dean, when I tell my friends that I'm reading a book on metaphysics, they look at me with a twisted face because some think it's a cult stuff. Others think, didn't science get rid of all that stuff 200 years ago? As a philosopher, as someone who teaches and thinks about metaphysics, how can metaphysics and the way of thinking of a metaphysician help us understand what's real?
Well, it doesn't seem to be something that we can get away from. So metaphysics seems, it keeps pulling me back in, like the Godfather. It continually buries its undertakers, I guess the saying goes. So there's a sense in which it's kind of inevitable, I think, the questions that metaphysics asks. Now you're asking, can it give us answers? I'm a bit skeptical how much confidence we should feel in the answers that we as metaphysicians come up with.
But why is it impossible to bury then?
Well, because to bury it would be to show that that the questions themselves are a tissue of confusion, that they're meaningless, they're senseless, you can't even raise them. If you ask them, you're making some fundamental mistake. That would be to really bury metaphysics. And that just hasn't happened. I mean, you can ignore it for a while, and there have been doctrines that have had the effect of declaring all metaphysical questions meaningless.
Logical positivism.
Logical positivism being the primary example of this. But then other movements have attempted to do an end run around metaphysics one way or another. But they always end up having some internal problems, or they're just a way of distracting us, and people end up asking the questions anyway.
Well, let's ask some of these questions. What are the constellation of metaphysical questions?
Well, I think the thing that unites most of the questions that come under the heading of metaphysics is that they have to do somehow with what's fundamental. If we can make sense of notions like fundamentally blah blah blah, or so and so happens in virtue of blah blah blah, we can make sense of the idea that some kind of levels of description of the world are more fundamental than others, are somehow explanatorily prior, that they somehow get at the joints in nature more. They carve closer to the joints. If we're willing to allow that those kinds of notions make sense, then you can ask all sorts of questions about the fundamental nature of reality.
Give us some specific examples of those questions.
Well, when you have many things that all are similar in some way, what fundamentally does that involve? Does it fundamentally involve something that they have in common, where this is a literal entity, a thing that exists in the world somehow, that's present in all of them?
So if I see a red toy, a red stop sign, a red sweater,
a red sunset.
Right, a red sunset, the question is, all those different things have something red. What is that red?
Yes. Right. So do you have to, this is the ancient problem of universals, do you have to posit something over and above the concrete entities, the toy, which is over here, and the sunset, which is, I don't know, in your mind, or maybe in the sky, and all these red things, do you have to, in addition to those, posit redness, which is what they all have in common? Or is it possible to regard this talk about features had in common, a feature that they have in common, can you regard that as sort of shorthand for something else, something that doesn't mention a feature? But so is the fundamental facts about common features really, are these facts about resemblance? So is the fundamental relation of resemblance the explanation for common attributes.
Okay.
So a lot of the questions are questions about what is there? What is there ultimately or fundamentally? And this is a question about whether there are, in addition to concrete things, universals.
Okay. Universals and concrete. We know there are concrete things. The question is, are there universals which are something over and above the group of concrete things? Okay, that's one category that metaphysics explores. What are some others?
The mind-body problem has sort of empirical aspects to it, obviously, that you can only settle by going and poking around in people's brains and so on. But it has more abstract metaphysical aspects to it as well. So you can, when you ask, what kind of thing am I, and what is thinking, one question there is, what kind of thing am I fundamentally? Mm-hmm. So do I belong in the category of material objects? That's a very broad sort of category that's going to be of interest to metaphysicians because they're interested in broad categories. Or am I not? Am I something else somehow that's not made up out of this kind of stuff? Mm-hmm.
And again, we're coming back to the word fundamental.
Yeah.
So what kind of fundamental properties or what kind of fundamental things are there? So you're always using the word fundamental.
Yeah, I think it comes in again and again in metaphysics. And that one way to try to resist metaphysics is to deny that, that there is a fundamental level. But of course, that in a way
is a fundamental level.
You're in a way, you're making all categories equally fundamental. And there have been metaphysicians who have proposed this sort of thing. Nelson Goodman basically said everything is like everything else in infinitely many ways. There's no ultimate.
But that doesn't do away with metaphysics. That's a metaphysical position.
Right. My point exactly. So we may not be able to settle these questions, answer them. I think we do make some progress in seeing in detail how the various answers hang together. But I don't think we're ever going to be able to stop answering them or asking them.
But is the metaphysical way of thinking helpful for other fields of importance, like all of science, which explores the physical world, or indeed theology, which purports to have access to a higher world?
Yeah, I regard metaphysics as sort of flowing kind of seamlessly into the foundations of physics and the foundations of philosophical theology. There are questions here which have to be approached from both sides by people who know both sides, people who are at home in both sides. So you look at philosophy of physics today, a lot of people who do philosophy of physics are metaphysicians. I mean, they're working on metaphysical foundations of physics, and it turns out that some metaphysical views fit better with certain physical theories than others. So they do have an impact on one another.
So would you believe then that people scientists in the scientific world, if they exhaust everything that they know from their approach, that they will still leave something out if they don't have a metaphysical approach to what they're doing?
Well, I would say that there will usually be questions that are left on the table, and they might not be questions that are of interest to the scientist. And they might not be questions that matter a great deal to the theories that the scientists propose. I think sometimes in theoretical physics, they really do matter. The metaphysics behind the thing is important. And of course, a lot of theoretical physicists have, in essence, been philosophers as well. And I think it's because you get sucked into these questions. So I think the questions will be there.